Dust. It painted the shanties we passed and packed the dirt paths our boots trotted against. It blew with the wind and stuck in your throat like that stubborn old goat that just won't. It's all nature ever sent our way for most of my 17 years, I'd reckon. Daddy asked for food, money, or shelter, but dust instead. Mama wanted everything for Kyle and me: education, manners, a reason to smile, but dust instead. It had been at least a few good years since the last storm, but we knew it was fixing to come. Miss Nature never missed a chance to spoil our fouled existence with more dust. Mom had been gone for what didn't feel like too long ago, but now that I lean on this bar, counting the years, my 7 fingers make the years feel as long as they are. I passed my eyes back to my brother. Kyle's glowing face and blonde locks was a spitting image of her. I sometimes saw her reflection in his matching hazel eyes. She'd always said that Kyle and I were 2 years apart. Assuming my assumptions about my own age are accurate, that would put Kyle at 15 now. I've shared all my memories with him. Heck, he was around before I could even remember stuff. The years get harder to count as we wandered on, but if I had to guess at it, I'd say Daddy died about 4 years ago. I at least know it was 3 years after Mom. Daddy was real adamant about having a calendar and keeping track of time. Dust got in their lungs and took 'em both. After Mama, I kinda reckon Daddy more or less let it take him. His boys were full-grown adults, plenty ready to fend for themselves, and his true love had left him, so he followed her down that path. I can still see him clear as day in my memories. That familiar visual, his deeply tanned skin, tall, gangly figure, dark chocolate waves of hair that matched his eyes. Hell, take 17 years off him, plop a white curly-brimmed hat on his head, and you're looking at me. Kyle and I have been wandering since the day Daddy passed. Wasn't anything for us in our hometown. Stone-Tooth's what they called it. And the shanty we lived in would blow apart every dustnado anyway. Dustnados were commonplace in Stone-Tooth. We got hit by 4 a year on a slow year. Our shanty was more like a wind chime than a housing structure. We were the only family we had, and we didn't rightfully mind it that way neither. Kyle and I have been traveling from town to town for years now, looking for work and moving along once the market dried out. And the market's always dried out. "Get back to work, Donald!" our boss barked. I looked up from the bar into the thick of the tables. They were splintered, sorry pieces of wood nailed together to form tables and chairs. Haggard drunks filled most of the available seatings. Shady salesmen, clumsy repairmen, and hideous harlots. These were the ever-revered members of Mootown's working class. Same people who'd turned their noses up to Wastelanders like Kyle and I. Wastelanding was far from easy, but we had our freedom. Donald's frumpy self sagged the chair legs beneath him. His bald spot screamed from the sea of people. Poor old goat was losing hair like a chicken loses eggs. He had that familiar slithering smile plastered on his cracking lips. He was sowing some sexy lies with one of those chunkier harlots. The bar hands ain't supposed to talk with the patrons. Donald wouldn't be getting paid today. He was raised on the beliefs of that great hippofoo or whatever. His whirly whiskers were evidence enough of that, but I couldn't help but wonder if incessant flirting was one of the founding pillars of that belief systems, too. We'd picked up Donald a couple towns back. Kyle and I were working in a mine. It was dang dirty work. 3 months in that mine and we had a major collapse. We scrambled like hell out of that mine. One of the support beams collapsed onto Kyle, pinning his legs down. Alone, I could only do so much to help us out of that fallen death pit. Lucky for us, Donald noticed our struggle and turned back to help. If not for his efforts, we'd both collapsed within that mine. Kyle and I were skipping town after all that, but we were stopped by a gathering crowd outside the local brothel. Turns out Donald had gotten himself in some sort of trouble. Well, we owed him a favor. So we snuck our way around the back to help find a way out for Donald. We distracted the crowd long enough for Donald to sneak out the back window. With our favor repaid, we snuck out of town and headed for the next job. We'd heard Moontown was the place to be, except we were accompanied by Donald. We were even, and I didn't want the company. But Kyle seemed all too thrilled by it, so I conceded. We've been in Moontown now for the past 2.5 months or so. There ain't much work in this town, leaving Kyle and me to bartend night after night. Moontown was a major drinking town, famous for booze and nothing else. The other Wastelanders had promised work here in Moontown. I suppose that bartending is work, just not the work either of us had in mind. It was, after all, one of the unspoken rules of wastelanding. Bars will always have work for Wastelanders. This was due in part because Wastelanders made up most of the bar's profits. As a second half of that rule, it was courtesy for a Wastelander to leave the bar after a couple days' work, opening the job for the next guy. To support the claims of our predecessors, there are plenty of bars here, which in turn means there was plenty of work here for a Wastelander. But Kyle and I were wanting something a little more permanent. We'd worked most of the bars in Moontown, and its circuit would be drying up soon. I could just about feel it at this point. We needed to be looking for our next stop, and soon. "What are you thinking, you idiot?" boss slapped Donald right on his bald spot as he walked to the bar. Bar hands aren't to be talking to the patrons in this bar. She started the conversation with me. Donald rubbed the back of his head. She's a harlot, our boss spat. She talks anything with a dick. I hope you realize you aren't getting paid today. Oh, come on, boss, Donald begged. I gave you 8 good hours today. You barely gave me 6. The boss reached into his tip jar from beneath the bar. He slapped a 20 in front of Kyle and another in front of me. I snatched another regular day's pay off the counter. I pulled Betty off my head, turned her upside down, and stuffed my payment into her deep crown. I plopped Betty back onto my head and fixed her dusty white brim so that its curve matched my eyebrows. The boss slapped 14 bills in front of Donald. Thank you, sir. Donald cradled his partial payment. Yeah, the boss groaned. Now get out of here, the lot of you. The boss's hairy forearm guided us to the exit. We stepped out the back exit, which led into an alley. The backs of these shanties that lined either side of this alley headed deep east and west. Bars, inns, food suppliers, knick-knack shops, and so much more lined these alleys. The alleys were a crummy place to spend the nights, but they were free. Beggars came more often than I cared to count. I assumed they'd learned to stop asking a bunch of poor Wastelanders for handouts. It takes every penny to keep myself clothed and fed, which didn't leave much for lazy bums. But I'm always quickly reminded as to why they come back around here whenever I watch Kyle give $1 to our 4 frequent vagabonds. He somehow was more frugal than I. Those donations occurred on every working day, and yet Kyle never ran out of food, money, or goodwill. I didn't get it. We pressed on through the alley looking for an unused spot to set up camp. We hadn't trucked too far from our bar before running into a familiar obstacle. There in the alley stood our newest fan. A young boy had been trailing us for the past 3 nights. He and Kyle were really fast friends. He was a strange child, his skin tanned red, his brown hair messier than a plate of goulash, and seemingly mute. These meetings were becoming routine, and it was time I addressed it. Kyle had already won over the favor of Donald, and this child seemed to be next. Although I didn't object, I didn't intend to make a habit out of adopting any more extra baggage, but the baggage this young boy carried outweighed the 3 of us tenfold. Can he travel with us? Kyle begged. I was surprised I didn't hear this one sooner. No, I retorted. He's just a kid, Kyle scolded. We can't leave him alone. He's a kid, I confirmed. And kids can't work. The last thing we need is another mouth to feed that ain't adding any money to the pot. Donald can barely work between flirting fits, and you keep him. Kyle stepped in my face. I don't keep Donald around by choice, I asserted. He's here because you insisted upon letting him come along. We aren't adopting anyone else, Kyle. Hey! A man shouted from behind me. I turned to face him and his army of goons with frown-fixed faces. They're taking our meal ticket! They shouted and began to close in. Instincts kicked in. Kyle swooped up the kid while Donald and I led the way. We kicked up a dust trail, turning down every other alley and diving in and out of bars. We were young and slick and lost our pursuers quicker than a snake bite. Once I was comfortable with the distance we'd created, I signaled for a stop. During our time bartending, we'd grown familiar with these back alleys. We'd worked most of the bars in the circuit, anywho. Despite all that, we still wound up behind one of the 3 bars in town we hadn't tended for. The Musty Tavern. It was aptly named, and hosts mostly to convicts. A place I wasn't too keen on bringing Kyle to, but with our pursuers and all familiar territory behind us, our choices were scarce. We slipped into the alley and entered the Musty Tavern from the rear exit. Seedy faces were fixed on the winded youngsters who just entered their bar from the exit. We played it cool with smiles, but our cover was blown upon entrance. The tables had been cleared to either side of the room as Moontown drunks redefined happy hour. The floorboards creaked beneath our feet. Just another hastily thrown together shack of a bar inn. After working so many, all these dives felt the same. Fancy light sockets were strung through the ceiling, but I knew this place didn't have no electricity. Probably no bulbs, neither. The oil lamps that sat on every surface was evidence enough that they couldn't use them fancy sockets. But most places had torn them out entirely. We'd worked through droves of drunks, stumble dancing to sporadic piano mashing. Kyle and his young friend cruised through the scene with such amusement on their faces. Donald's eyes darted this way and that, probably looking for the drunkest woman in the crowd. I was headed for the stairs. I thought about blending in with the crowd, but should our hungry hunters show up, there'd be no place for us to run. I had to keep my eyes over my shoulder to make sure Kyle didn't get lost in their laughter, and to be sure Donald didn't make any moves. I led my team up to the bar's 2nd floor. There was less prying eyes up there, and most drunks were scared of heights. Kyle and him giggled their way up behind me, and a distracted Donald took up the rear. We settled at the back half of the bar nearest the inn's rooms. Kyle offloaded his little buddy, and it was time for me to get some answers. I approached the kid with my friendliest smile and a mind full of whys. I'm Henry, I introduced myself. It's like Henry, without the H. That's what I tell people. The little one gave that a giggle. This old fellow behind me is Donald. We picked him up a couple towns back. He's probably 30-something, old as dust, but harmless anyway. And that man whose hand you're holding is my own baby brother Kyle. He's so smitten on you, I'd watch out for a kiss. I smirked with a wink. The kid giggled back. All right, then, I said. What did you do to piss them men off? I asked. He reached into his vest pocket and retrieved a ragged old blue handkerchief. It was folded real nice and tied in a bow. His grimy fingers undid the bow and revealed the treasure of 2 cornbread muffins within the worn fabric. 2 cornbread muffins? I dismissed his concerns with a wave. Why, we should have enough cornbread muffins to feed those guys. I looked back at the little guy, and he was shaking his head quite rapidly. No, he made that answer very clear. He then pointed to the muffin, and then back to himself. I was baffled. I imagine my face told him that well enough. He pointed back to the muffin and bit a chunk out of it. He then pointed back to himself and pretended to bite a chunk out of himself. Took me a second, but I had a hunch. They wanted to eat you? I asked. He nodded. Well, we can't let that happen. I stood straight and leaned against the wall. I wasn't thrilled about adopting this darn kid, but I couldn't rightfully leave him to a bunch of cannibals neither. I reckon I knew from the get-go I'd be caving in to Kyle on this one. I at least wanted to make him work for it. But my hands were forced, and it was time to play it out. Well, if you're going to be coming with us, we'll need to call you something. What's your name, little one? I asked. He pointed to his heart, where a little kindergarten name tag was stuck up against his brown vest. Funny to think how people still went to school these days. Stonetooth had quit teaching school while Kyle was in kindergarten. Never realized the end of schooling wasn't a wasteland-wide thing. The dust had faded out most of the letters on the kid's name tag except for T and M. Well, all right then, I decided. We'll call you Little TM. He smiled. That was a new one. I suspect Kyle had been awaiting this conversation. He grinned the whole time. He knew I was mellow when he showed that smile. I couldn't help but stare at it, kind of soak it all in. Man, how it reminded me of Mom. I couldn't stomach the feelings to tell him that and didn't reckon I ever would. But I never tired of having that feeling back in my life. A feeling uniquely tied with my brother. We have a full crew now, Henry, Kyle exclaimed. Sure do, but I wish we could shake this geezer, I scoffed. Oh, shut up, Donald replied. How are we getting out of this town, Kyle? I hollered over to my brother. Why can't we try and reason with them? Kyle asked. They're trying to eat a child, Kyle. There's no reasoning with them folk. I shot back. We've run into some cuckoo characters while wastelanding, but I've never thought I'd actually run into cannibals. Kyle sunk back into himself and reached into his pants pocket. After some fishing, he'd retrieved a crinkled map. He opened it up and spread it onto the nearest table. The crinkled outline of Moontown was detailed in ink on this map. Just another collection of beat-down shanties. Every town's map was beginning to blend into the other. Good thing I never had to worry about reading them. I haven't the slightest where Carl found this, but he'd always been resourceful like that. We gathered around to hear the plan we already knew he'd concocted. Little Tim was too small to seat on the top of the table, and Kyle hoisted him up and onto the chair so he could join the meeting. So we're here, Kyle stated, pointing out our location on the map. The least paved path out of town will send us right into the heart of the crime syndicate. No one's hungry enough to follow us there. But once there, it's out of the frying pan and into the fire for us. We'll have to stick to the outer roads on our way out of town, which will turn a day's walk into a 3 days walk. Kyle detailed his plans with his index finger darting all over the paper. Sound like a plan? I asked. It'll have to be, Donald said, pointing to the bar's floor. Our pursuers had entered the bar and were now speaking with the bar's owners. Let's get! I led my squad to the nearest door. I rammed my shoulder into it and broke it wide open. I had to check my eyes as I just barged into 2 women doing something too freaky for any 17-year-old to see. Kyle and Tim were the next into the room, and they were even faster past the skeptical. Of course, Donald had to stop and chat. You ladies need a third? He offered. Donald was flipped 3 fingers, and he flashed them an ass cheek. Get your pants on and get over here, I flagged Donald over to the window. I hoisted little Tim out the window and onto the roof first. I followed him through, then Kyle, followed by Donald, who was still gawking at the ladies. There wasn't space enough on the roof's awning for 4 people, as the elbows in each other's sides soon pointed out. I took the lead off the awning and fell further than I'd realized, but still stuck the landing. Come on, little Tim, I'll catch you. I motioned for the little man to jump in my arms. He was scared pale. Of course, Kyle scooped him up and leapt with him in his arms. Kyle's landing wasn't near as graceful as my own. He landed and fell with a thud right onto his back. He'd at least managed to protect little Tim from the impact. Kyle tried to be cool, standing back up and dusting himself off. The focus was soon back on Donald, who still had half his face stuck in the window. Donald, get down here, scolded between gritted teeth. Donald turned his focus on us and left from the roof back down. His landing was pretty clean, too. There they are! Our pursuers shouted with a point as they exited the bar. Dang it, Donald! You took too long. TM hopped on Kyle's back and we were foot hoofing and huffing through the town. Any sense of a plan had fled my mind, but Kyle's backseat running kept us on track. Turn left here, he'd shout, and I'd oblige. Calls of left, right, and keep straight filled the air as we steered south. We'd long since lost track of them guys from the bar, but we pressed on. I wanted to create as much distance between them and us before we were gassed. I think Kyle was hoping to get us to the bad part of town before stopping, but we came short of that goal. A couple clicks back, I noticed Kyle's shouts becoming less and less prominent. I turned over my shoulder to spot him, and he was trailing at a snail's pace. I motioned for us to stop and let him catch up. We can keep going, Kyle insisted between pants. I don't think we need to, I said. But you definitely don't need to keep going with TM on your back. You sound like you just got done being strangled. TM left off Kyle's back, and Kyle crashed to the ground with his back against the nearest shanty. For real, guys, Kyle started. Once we get south, we need to lay low, he stressed to us. This is serious. People get sold to labor camps on an hourly basis down here. I heard the sex trafficking market down there was pretty booming. Donald danced his fingers through the air while Kyle cringed. I'd be fine with that. Hook me up with some hot senorita and I'll be all good, Donald continued. Stop it, Donald, Kyle scolded. This is no joking matter. Cool it, everybody, I stepped in. We're going to be in and out of that place in no time. No labor camps and no sex trafficking. In and out. The boys fussed a bit with curled lips, but my words kept them silent. We set up camp for the night in that cozy back alley. Kyle gave his sleeping bag to Tim, and I gave my sleeping bag to Kyle. We would need to get that boy a sleeping bag in the morning. I came up to Kyle and Tim to relinquish my sleeping bag, but Tim seemed to be fussing about something. His bottom lip curled like a noodle, and his mumbles were like little darts of anger. I wasn't much for tolerating tantrums, especially from random strays. What's wrong with him? I asked. I'm not sure, Kyle said. But don't worry, I got this. Kyle knelt beside TM with a confident smile. Hey, TM, Kyle got his troubled attention. What did the cannibal say to his wife? I didn't like where this joke was headed. I could just eat you up, Kyle punchlined. TM gazed at Kyle with an unamused face. He'd at least stopped making that ear-torturing whining sound, which was all I cared about. I left them to each other and to their bad jokes. I cracked open a can of beans, pulled a spoon from the bag, blew off the dust, and dug into my bean dinner. We'd be running into the desert soon, so I had to conserve water, only washing down the beans when my throat became too dry to swallow. I hadn't paid attention to the food Kyle or Donald had gotten the last time we bought provisions, but I stuck with beans. They were cheap and filling. Kyle usually stuck with vegetables, as he had the diet of a rabbit, and Donald typically loaded up on potatoes, mashed. That was the largest culprit of his growing gut. I watched Kyle and TM stargaze themselves to sleep that night. The sense of wonder in both their eyes was like Mama's chicken noodle soup slurping down my gullet. It was good for Kyle to be in the company of a like-minded person. I sometimes feared my pessimistic ways might actually change him, and TM had taken a liking to Kyle right off the bat. That Kyle really had a knack for picking up strays, a habit I wasn't fully a fan of. Donald had kept pretty mellow since we picked him up, but just like Dust NATOs, I felt it was only a matter of time before his urges got us into more trouble. I could only take things a day at a time out here. Living as Wastelanders like we did, you were liable to just get killed in your sleep and never see the morning. A lesser man might feel the need to assign a night watch, but we were used to sleeping light. Hey, thanks for listening, and if you're just dying to figure out what happens to Kyle and Henry next, then please support the official release on Amazon and the link in my description. Otherwise, stay tuned for Chapter 2. Thank you,